Good evening. Welcome back to my YouTube channel, Deep Sleep History. And tonight, I'd like you to imagine a landscape that looked remarkably different from the one we know today. A century ago, there were no glittering skylines stretching across the Mediterranean coast, no bustling highways linking modern cities, no internationally recognized State of Israel. Instead, the land was a patchwork of ancient villages, olive groves that had stood for generations, quiet farming communities, sacred places visited by pilgrims, and bustling market towns where many languages could be heard before sunrise. This small stretch of land has carried countless names throughout history. To some, it was the ancient homeland remembered through centuries of prayer. To others, it was simply the place where their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents had always lived. Over thousands of years, empires rose and disappeared here. Kings ruled, caliphs governed, crusaders marched, merchants traded, pilgrims traveled, families planted trees whose fruit would feed children not yet born. Yet none of them could have imagined just how dramatically the 20th century would reshape this landscape. Tonight, we won't rush through headlines or modern politics. Instead, we'll quietly walk backward through time. We'll meet farmers preparing their fields before sunrise, travelers crossing dusty roads, merchants opening wooden shutters before the markets awaken, religious communities living side by side, sometimes peacefully, sometimes uneasily. We'll discover why people from thousands of kilometers away dreamed of returning here. We'll see why local families worried about the future.
We'll follow diplomats, drawing lines on maps far from the villages whose destinies they were changing. And we'll watch how a land that had belonged to many empires gradually became one of the most debated places on Earth. As always, this journey isn't about choosing sides. History is rarely as simple as heroes and villains. The same event can look entirely different depending on whose memories you inherit. So tonight, we'll simply follow the evidence as carefully as we can, listening to many voices from the past. Before we begin, take a comfortable position. Dim the lights if you like. Perhaps make yourself a warm cup of tea and allow the noise of the modern world to slowly drift away. Our story begins not in 1948, not during the Second World War, but many centuries earlier. Because to understand why the modern State of Israel came into existence, we first need to understand why this small corner of the world mattered so deeply to so many different people. Close your eyes if you wish. Imagine standing on a gentle hill overlooking rolling fields, touched by the golden light of early morning. Stone houses cluster together around narrow streets. The distant sound of church bells mingles with the call to prayer. Somewhere nearby, a synagogue welcomes its first worshippers of the day. Shepherds guide their sheep across rocky hillsides. Children chase one another through dusty paths.
Merchants prepare baskets of figs, olives, dates, spices, and woven cloth before the market opens. Life moves slowly. The seasons matter more than politics. Rain determines harvests. Harvests determine survival. For many families living here 100 years ago, the future seemed likely to resemble the past. Few imagined that within only a few decades, the world around them would change forever.
And that is where our story truly begins. The morning sun rose slowly over the hills, just as it had for countless generations. Long before international borders divided this land, long before diplomats gathered around polished tables in distant capitals, and decades before anyone imagined the modern state of Israel, this region was simply another province of a vast empire. For nearly 400 years, from the early 16th century until the end of the First World War, most of this land was governed by the Ottoman Empire. To many of its residents, daily life was shaped less by grand politics than by the rhythm of the seasons. Rain brought hope, drought brought worry, harvests determined comfort or hardship. Most people would never meet an emperor. Few would ever travel farther than the nearest market town. Their world was measured not in countries, but in villages, fields, family ties, and places of worship. Imagine walking through a quiet village around the year 1900. Stone homes stand close together along narrow paths. Olive trees stretch across nearby hills. Goats wander lazily between low walls. The smell of freshly baked bread drifts from simple ovens. A blacksmith hammers glowing iron into tools. Children laugh as they chase each other through dusty streets. Women draw water from community wells. Farmers prepare their fields before the heat of the afternoon arrives. Life is demanding, yet it follows patterns that have changed very little for centuries. The people living here come from many different backgrounds. The largest communities are Arabic-speaking Muslims, who make up most of the population. Alongside them live Arabic-speaking Christians, whose families have worshipped in this region for generations. There are also long-established Jewish communities in cities such as Jerusalem, Safed, Hebron, and Tiberias. Many of these Jewish families have lived here continuously for centuries. Others arrived over different periods, often drawn by the religious importance of the land. Despite their differences, daily life often brings neighbors together. Markets become shared spaces. Farmers trade crops. Craftsmen sell their work. Children sometimes play together, even when their families attend different places of worship. Disagreements certainly exist, so do occasional tensions. But much of everyday life is occupied by practical concerns rather than political arguments. People worry about taxes, about rainfall, about livestock, about finding enough work to support their families. The Ottoman government oversees this diverse region through local officials. Taxes are collected. Roads receive occasional repairs. Military service is required for some, but many villages remain largely self-governing in their daily affairs. Travel across the countryside is slow. Most journeys are made on foot, horseback, or by donkey. A trip that today might take an hour by car could require an entire day. News travels just as slowly. A letter carried from one city to another may take days to arrive. Rumors often move faster than official announcements. Jerusalem already holds extraordinary significance. For Jews, it is the city of ancient temples and centuries of longing. For Christians, it is the setting of Jesus' final days. For Muslims, it is home to one of Islam's holiest sanctuaries. Pilgrims continue arriving from across the world. Some stay only briefly. Others decide never to leave. The city's streets echo with many languages: Arabic, Turkish, Hebrew, Armenian, Greek, Russian, French, English. Every visitor brings another story, another memory, another reason for making the journey. Outside the cities, however, life changes very slowly. Most families rely on agriculture: olives, wheat, barley, grapes, figs, dates. These crops have sustained communities for generations. Land is deeply valuable, not simply because it can be sold, but because it feeds families. It carries memories. It connects grandparents to grandchildren. Ownership can be surprisingly complicated. Some land belongs directly to farming families. Some belongs to wealthy landowners living in distant cities. Other land is managed under different legal arrangements inherited over centuries. These details, seemingly unimportant at the time, will later influence events in unexpected ways. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire itself is beginning to weaken. Across Europe, powerful industrial nations are expanding their influence. Railways spread rapidly. Factories reshape economies. National movements grow stronger. Ideas travel farther than ever before. The empire governing this quiet land struggles to keep pace with these enormous changes. Few villages fully understand the forces gathering beyond the horizon. Even fewer realize that decisions made in London, Paris, Vienna, Berlin, and St. Petersburg will soon reshape their future. The old empire still appears permanent. Its flag still flies above government buildings. Its officials continue collecting taxes. Its soldiers continue guarding roads. Yet beneath this appearance of stability, history is already beginning to move. Far away in Europe, another story is unfolding. A story involving millions of Jewish families living far from this land, many facing growing discrimination, many wondering where they truly belong, and some beginning to dream of returning to what they believed was their ancient homeland. Those dreams will soon begin changing the history of this quiet corner of the world. And that is where our journey continues.
As the 20th century slowly approached, life in the villages of Ottoman Palestine continued much as it always had. The olive trees still swayed in the warm Mediterranean breeze. Merchants still arranged colorful spices before sunrise. Farmers still watched the sky, hoping for enough rain to nourish another harvest. But thousands of kilometers away, across the towns and cities of Europe, a very different story was unfolding. For centuries, Jewish communities had lived far from the land their ancestors remembered in prayers and sacred writings. Some families had been away for hundreds of years. Others traced their roots back even further. Over generations, Jewish communities became part of many different societies. They lived in cities such as Warsaw, Vienna, Odessa, Berlin, Paris, Amsterdam, and countless smaller towns. They spoke many languages. Some spoke Yiddish, a language shaped by centuries of Jewish life in Central and Eastern Europe. Others spoke German, Russian, Polish, Arabic, Persian, Ladino, French, or English. Their clothing, customs, and daily routines often reflected the countries where they lived. Yet many families continued ending religious ceremonies with the same ancient hope: next year in Jerusalem. For some, these words were deeply spiritual, a prayer, a tradition.
Symbol of faith rather than a political goal. But during the 19th century, new ideas began spreading across Europe. One of the most powerful was nationalism. Across the continent, many peoples began asking similar questions. What makes a nation? Should people who share a language, history, or culture have a homeland of their own? These ideas inspired movements in Italy, Germany, Greece, and many other places. Among some Jewish thinkers, a similar question emerged. If many nations hoped for self-determination, could the Jewish people one day have a homeland as well? For many, this was no longer only a religious dream. It became a political idea, one that would later be known as Zionism. Its supporters were far from united. Some believed returning to the ancestral homeland offered safety. Others saw it as cultural renewal. Still others hoped it would simply allow Jewish communities to live without fear of persecution. Not every Jewish person agreed. Many felt fully at home in the countries where they already lived. Some believed their future belonged in Europe. Others argued that faith, not politics, should guide their hopes for Jerusalem. There was no single Jewish opinion. The community was diverse, with many different beliefs about the future. At the same time, life for many Jewish families in parts of Europe was becoming increasingly difficult. In several regions, discrimination remained a constant part of daily life. Restrictions limited where some could live. Certain professions were harder to enter. Universities sometimes imposed quotas.
Old prejudices continued from one generation to the next. Then, violence occasionally erupted. Riots, known as pogroms, struck several Jewish communities, particularly within parts of the Russian Empire. Homes were damaged, businesses were destroyed, families fled with little more than what they could carry. For many survivors, the question became impossible to ignore. Would they ever truly be safe? Some chose to immigrate to the United States. Others moved to Canada, Argentina, South Africa, or Western Europe. And a smaller but growing number looked towards Ottoman Palestine. Not because it promised an easy life. In truth, it offered anything but comfort. The land required enormous effort. Swamps spread disease. Rocky soil demanded years of labor. Water was often scarce. Economic opportunities were uncertain. Still, for those inspired by the idea of rebuilding an ancient homeland, the hardships seemed worthwhile. Beginning in the late 19th century, groups of Jewish immigrants gradually arrived. Some came alone, others traveled as entire families.
A few arrived with little money but great determination. They established small farming communities, purchased available land through legal transactions from landowners, planted vineyards, drained marshes, built simple homes from stone and timber. Their villages were modest. Many struggled financially. Some failed altogether. Others slowly began to grow. To the local Arab communities, these newcomers represented something unfamiliar. Some neighbors welcomed opportunities for trade and employment. Others watched the changes with uncertainty. Most could not yet imagine how significant these new settlements would become. At first, the numbers remained relatively small. The region was still overwhelmingly populated by long-established Arab, Muslim, and Christian communities. Life for many people continued much as before. Markets opened each morning. Harvests followed the seasons. Pilgrims continued arriving in Jerusalem. Children still played beneath olive trees. Yet beneath this ordinary routine, history had quietly begun to shift. A new movement had taken root. Its supporters believed they were returning home after centuries away. Many local residents believed they were witnessing gradual changes in the land where their own families had lived for generations. Neither side could yet foresee how these two deeply held perspectives would one day collide. And while these early migrations remained relatively small, events unfolding across Europe and the coming of a devastating global war would soon transform everything. That is where our story continues.
The first years of the 20th century passed quietly across much of the countryside. Farmers continued tending their olive groves. Caravans still traveled along ancient roads. The call to prayer echoed across the hills, while church bells and synagogue prayers marked the passing of each week. To many people living in this land, life seemed steady, even if it was never easy. Few could imagine that a single event in Europe would soon reshape not only their future, but the political map of much of the Middle East. In the summer of 1914, Europe was pulled into a conflict unlike any the world had seen before. What began as a crisis between powerful nations quickly grew into the First World War. Empires that had ruled for centuries suddenly found themselves fighting for survival. The Ottoman Empire, which had governed Palestine for nearly 400 years, entered the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. Almost overnight, this quiet province became part of a much larger struggle. Young men were called into military service. Some left their villages never to return. Others marched across deserts and mountains, carrying supplies instead of weapons. For ordinary families, the war brought uncertainty. Trade slowed. Food became harder to obtain. Prices rose. In some areas, harvests failed. Diseases spread more easily among populations already weakened by hunger. Letters from relatives at the front arrived rarely. Sometimes they never arrived at all. Parents waited for sons.
Wives waited for husbands. Children waited for fathers whose footsteps never again echoed through their homes. Even those far from the battlefields could feel the weight of the war. Meanwhile, powerful governments in Europe were already thinking beyond the fighting. They were asking difficult questions. What would happen if the Ottoman Empire lost? Who would control its vast territories? How should its lands be divided? These conversations took place in government offices, hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away from the villages whose future was being discussed. The people living on the land had little voice in these decisions. In 1917, another important development took place. The British government issued what became known as the Balfour Declaration. It was a short letter, but its impact would echo through history. In it, Britain expressed support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, while also stating that the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities should not be harmed. To some Jewish communities around the world, the declaration brought hope. After centuries of dispersion, many believed that one of the world's great powers now supported their long-held aspirations. For others, it raised many questions. What exactly did national home mean? Would it become a state?
How would it affect the people already living there? Among the Arab population of Palestine, news of the declaration caused growing concern. Many families had lived on the land for generations. They wondered how promises made by distant governments might change their future. Some asked a simple question: how could another government promise a homeland in a place where people were already living? At the same time, British leaders had made different promises to different groups during the war. Some Arab leaders believed Britain had also supported the idea of greater Arab independence after the Ottoman Empire's defeat. As these overlapping promises became known, confusion and mistrust began to grow. When the war finally ended in 1918, the Ottoman Empire had collapsed. Its centuries of rule over Palestine came to an end. For the first time in nearly 400 years, a new power would govern the region. British soldiers now patrolled the streets where Ottoman officials had once worked. New flags flew over government buildings. New laws gradually replaced old ones. For many villages, daily life remained much the same. The olive harvest still had to be gathered.
Animals still needed care. Markets still opened each morning. Yet beneath these familiar routines, the political foundations of the region had shifted dramatically. The empire that had once seemed permanent was gone. In its place stood a British administration trying to balance competing expectations, conflicting promises, and growing nationalist movements. It would prove to be an extraordinarily difficult task. Over the next 2 decades, more Jewish immigrants would arrive. Many would come seeking safety. Many Arab residents would grow increasingly worried about the rapid changes taking place around them. What had once been a quiet province of a fading empire was slowly becoming the focus of international attention. The choices made during and immediately after the First World War would shape the future of the land for generations to come. And as the 1920s began, the pace of change would only grow faster. The story of coexistence, hope, fear, and competing national aspirations was entering an entirely new chapter. And that is where our journey continues.
The war was over. The guns had largely fallen silent. Across Europe, families began rebuilding lives that had been interrupted by years of conflict. In Palestine, however, peace did not bring certainty. Instead, it brought change. The old Ottoman Empire had disappeared. In its place stood a new administration under British rule. For many villages, the first signs of this transition were surprisingly ordinary. Government offices displayed different flags, officials spoke different languages. New uniforms appeared on familiar streets. British soldiers replaced Ottoman troops. To an olive farmer living in a quiet village, these changes might have seemed distant at first. The fields still needed tending, the sheep still required care, the seasons still determined survival. Yet slowly, almost unnoticed, the political landscape beneath everyday life was shifting. The British administration faced an extraordinarily difficult challenge. It was responsible for governing a land that held profound meaning for different communities. It also had to navigate expectations shaped by wartime promises, international diplomacy, and rising nationalist movements. No decision pleased everyone.
And almost every decision disappointed someone. During the early 1920s, Jewish immigration continued. The numbers remained modest compared with the total population, but they were steadily increasing. Many newcomers arrived from Eastern Europe. Some carried little more than a suitcase, others brought farming tools, books, or family photographs. Some were young idealists who dreamed of building new agricultural communities. They worked long hours clearing rocky fields, planting orchards, and constructing simple homes. Life was demanding. Malaria was still a serious threat in some areas. Money was often scarce. Success was far from guaranteed. Many settlements struggled during their early years, but determination kept many of them alive. At the same time, the region's long-established Arab communities continued their own daily routines. Farmers harvested wheat and olives. Merchants traded in bustling markets. Craftsmen repaired tools and built furniture. Religious festivals brought families together just as they had for generations. Most people still focused on ordinary concerns. Would this year's harvest be good? Would enough rain fall? Would children remain healthy? Would prices at the market stay fair? Yet beneath these familiar rhythms, new questions quietly emerged. As more land changed ownership through legal purchases from landowners, some local tenant farmers found themselves uncertain about their future. In certain cases, families who had cultivated land for years discovered that ownership rested elsewhere. Not every transaction led to displacement. Many did not. But where it happened, it created anxiety and resentment. At the same time, many Jewish immigrants believed they were legally purchasing land and rebuilding communities through peaceful means. From their perspective, they were investing in agriculture, creating homes, and fulfilling a long-held national aspiration. The same event could therefore be viewed in very different ways. One family saw opportunity, another saw uncertainty. History often unfolds like this, not through simple stories of right and wrong, but through deeply human experiences that rarely fit into easy categories. Meanwhile, towns such as Jerusalem, Jaffa, and Haifa became increasingly diverse. Arabic, Hebrew, English, Armenian, Greek, and many other languages could be heard in busy streets. New schools opened, new newspapers appeared, political organizations slowly gained influence. Ideas spread more quickly than ever before.
Coffee houses became places not only for conversation, but also for debate. People discussed immigration, land, representation, identity, and the future of the country. For centuries, many people had thought of themselves primarily through religion, family, village, or local community. Now, larger national identities were becoming increasingly important. Among both Arabs and Jews, a growing number of people began asking similar questions. Who should govern this land? What would its future look like? Could different national aspirations exist side by side, or would one eventually come into conflict with the other? The British authorities hoped they could maintain order while balancing these competing expectations. It was an enormous responsibility, and one that became more difficult with each passing year. Small disagreements occasionally grew into larger disputes. Rumors spread quickly. Trust became harder to build. Although many neighbors continued trading together and living peacefully, political tensions slowly increased beneath the surface. Looking back today, historians often describe the 1920s as a decade of gradual transformation. Nothing changed overnight. There was no single moment when everything suddenly became different. Instead, the land evolved one conversation, one settlement, one government decision, and one family at a time. By the end of the decade, the region looked noticeably different from how it had only 20 years earlier. The pace of immigration had increased, political awareness had grown, and communities that once mostly worried about crops and commerce were beginning to think more about borders, representation, and national futures. The calm surface of everyday life still remained, but beneath it, the currents of history were growing stronger. And soon, events far beyond this small land would once again accelerate change in ways few could have imagined. That is where our story continues.
As the 1930s quietly unfolded, the mornings in Palestine still began in familiar ways. The first light touched the limestone walls of Jerusalem. Fishermen pushed their wooden boats into the Mediterranean before sunrise. Farmers walked among rows of olive trees, checking branches that had been cared for by generations before them. Children hurried to school carrying books beneath their arms. At first glance, life still appeared peaceful, but beneath these ordinary scenes, the world was changing faster than ever before. Far away in Europe, political storms were gathering. Economic hardship had spread after the Great Depression. Millions struggled to find work. Frustration and anger grew in many countries. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, extremist political movements gained support. One of them was led by a man named Adolf Hitler. When Hitler became Germany's leader in 1933, life changed dramatically for Germany's Jewish population. New laws gradually restricted their rights. Many lost government jobs. Some businesses were boycotted. Children found themselves separated or excluded in schools. For countless Jewish families, the future suddenly felt uncertain. Many began searching for somewhere safe to rebuild their lives. Some hoped to reach the United States.
Others applied to move to Britain, South America, or elsewhere. And many looked toward Palestine. As persecution in Europe intensified, Jewish immigration into Palestine increased. Ships carrying new arrivals reached Mediterranean ports. Some passengers brought only a suitcase. Others carried treasured family photographs, books, or religious items that had survived long journeys. Many believed they were leaving danger behind. For them, Palestine represented hope, a place where they might finally build secure lives. Meanwhile, many Arab residents watched these changes with growing concern. The population was changing more quickly than before. New neighborhoods appeared. Hebrew-speaking communities expanded. Economic opportunities grew in some places. Yet so did uncertainty. Many wondered what these changes would mean for the future of the land. Would there still be room for everyone? Would political power remain balanced? Or was something much larger beginning to unfold? These questions became increasingly difficult to answer. During the 1930s, tensions between communities rose. Disagreements over land, immigration, and political representation became more intense. There were periods of violence, followed by efforts to restore order. Many innocent people, both Arab and Jewish, found themselves caught in the middle of unrest they had never wanted.
Most ordinary families simply hoped for peace. Parents wanted children to grow up safely. Farmers wanted successful harvests. Shopkeepers wanted customers. Neighbors wanted stability. Yet fear often spreads faster than trust. The British authorities faced growing pressure from every direction. Jewish leaders asked Britain to allow more immigration, especially as conditions in Europe became increasingly dangerous. Arab leaders argued that continued immigration threatened the future of the country's existing population. Britain found itself trying to satisfy demands that often pulled in opposite directions. No solution pleased everyone. Government reports were written. Committees investigated the situation. Officials debated possible compromises. But each proposal created new disagreements. Some suggested dividing the land. Others rejected the idea entirely. Some wanted stricter limits on immigration.
Others believed closing the doors would condemn desperate refugees who had nowhere else to go. Every choice carried profound consequences. History rarely offers perfect solutions. Sometimes governments must choose between deeply difficult alternatives, each carrying its own costs. By the late 1930s, Europe itself was becoming increasingly unstable. The warnings were growing impossible to ignore. Newspaper headlines spoke of military expansion. Diplomats rushed between capitals. People hoped another great war could still be avoided. Many remembered the terrible losses of the First World War. Surely, they thought, the world would never allow such destruction to happen again. But history had other plans. Across Europe, Jewish families continued searching for safety. Across Palestine, Arab families continued wondering what tomorrow would bring. Across Britain, officials struggled to govern a land where competing hopes and fears were becoming harder to reconcile. The decade was drawing to a close. Soon, events on a global scale would transform every calculation. The Second World War would begin, and with it, one of the darkest chapters in human history.
a tragedy so immense that it would forever change international opinion, reshape political decisions, and profoundly influence the future of Palestine. The choices made after that war would lead directly toward the creation of a new state. But before that could happen, the world itself would first have to endure unimaginable loss. And that is where our story continues.
As the final years of the 1930s faded into history, the clouds gathering over Europe finally broke. In September 1939, the Second World War began. Once again, millions of ordinary people found their lives transformed almost overnight. Across Europe, trains carried soldiers instead of tourists. Factories that once produced everyday goods now built weapons and military equipment. Families gathered around radios each evening, listening anxiously for the latest news from distant battlefields. No one knew how long the war would last. Few imagined just how devastating it would become. For Jewish communities across Europe, the danger grew rapidly. As Nazi Germany expanded its control over more territories, anti-Jewish laws became harsher. Families who had lived in the same towns for generations were forced from their homes. Businesses were confiscated. Schools closed their doors to Jewish children. Communities that had flourished for centuries were gradually dismantled. As the war continued, the persecution escalated into the Holocaust, the systematic murder of approximately 6 million Jewish men, women, and children by Nazi Germany and its collaborators. Entire families disappeared. Ancient communities were destroyed. Countless stories, traditions, and memories were lost forever. The scale of the tragedy shocked the world. Even today, it remains one of the darkest chapters in human history. For the survivors, freedom did not immediately bring peace. When the war ended in 1945, many had no homes to return to. Some discovered that their families had been killed. Others found their neighborhoods destroyed or occupied. Many spent months or even years in displaced persons camps across Europe. They waited. They hoped. And they asked one difficult question: where can we begin again? For many, Palestine seemed like the answer. It represented not only a place of historical and religious significance, but also the possibility of rebuilding lives after imaginable loss. However, the situation in Palestine had also become increasingly complicated. The British government, trying to reduce tensions between Jewish and Arab communities, had placed limits on Jewish immigration before and during the war. These restrictions remained controversial. Some Jewish organizations argued that survivors desperately needed a safe place to live. Many Arab leaders remained concerned that large-scale immigration would permanently alter the region's population and political future. The British administration found itself caught between humanitarian pressures, political commitments, and growing unrest. Ships carrying Jewish refugees sometimes attempted to reach Palestine despite immigration limits. Some passengers were allowed to enter, others were turned away or detained. Each ship carried stories of loss, hope, and uncertainty. Meanwhile, the Arab communities of Palestine continued watching events unfold with growing concern. They had also endured years of political uncertainty. Many feared that decisions being made by powerful governments would determine the future of their homeland without their full participation. Across towns and villages, conversations became increasingly serious. What would happen after the war? Would Britain remain in control? Would a new political arrangement emerge? Could two national movements, with different histories and aspirations, find a way to share the same land peacefully? These questions had no easy answers. By 1946, Britain was exhausted. The Second World War had drained its economy and stretched its military resources. Maintaining order in Palestine was becoming more difficult and increasingly costly. Violence between different groups, along with attacks on British forces by some armed organizations, convinced many British leaders that they could no longer manage the situation indefinitely. The future of Palestine was no longer simply a regional issue. It had become an international question. World leaders recognized that a lasting solution would require broader discussion. Attention increasingly turned towards a relatively new international organization created after the war, the United Nations.
Many hoped it could succeed where previous efforts had struggled. Committees were formed. Representatives traveled. Maps were studied. Witnesses gave testimony. Every proposal attempted to answer an extraordinarily difficult question. How could one land, deeply meaningful to multiple communities, be governed fairly? The discussions would lead to one of the most significant proposals in the modern history of the region. A proposal that would inspire hope for some and deep disappointment for others. Within a few short years, that proposal would change the course of history forever. And that is where our story continues.
By the autumn of 1947, the long years of uncertainty had reached a turning point. For nearly 3 decades, Britain had governed Palestine. It had faced growing tensions, competing promises, waves of immigration, protests, and increasing violence. Now, British leaders had reached a difficult conclusion. They no longer believed they could find a political solution acceptable to everyone. Instead, they decided to place the question before the world's newest international organization, the United Nations. Delegates from many countries gathered to examine one of the most complicated problems of the 20th century. Maps covered large tables. Population statistics were carefully studied. Reports from historians, diplomats, and local representatives filled countless pages. There was one question that seemed almost impossible to answer. How could two national movements, each believing they had a deep connection to the same land, both achieve their aspirations? The United Nations formed a special committee to investigate. Its members traveled through Palestine. They visited cities. They met community leaders. They listened to different perspectives. No proposal could erase decades of mistrust. Yet the committee eventually recommended a plan that it believed offered the best chance for peace. The proposal was straightforward in principle, though enormously difficult in practice. The land would be divided into 2 independent states. One would be predominantly Jewish, the other would be predominantly Arab. Jerusalem, because of its extraordinary importance to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, would not belong exclusively to either state. Instead, it would be placed under international administration, allowing people of all faiths to continue visiting its sacred sites. On paper, the idea appeared balanced. In reality, it was far more complicated.
The proposed borders were irregular. Communities were deeply mixed. Some villages lay only a few kilometers apart, but would suddenly find themselves on opposite sides of new boundaries. Thousands of families wondered where they would belong. For many Jewish leaders, the proposal represented a historic opportunity. Although the suggested borders were smaller than some had hoped for, many accepted the plan. After generations without an independent state, and only 2 years after the Holocaust, the possibility of internationally recognized self-government seemed extraordinary. Celebrations broke out in some Jewish neighborhoods. People danced in the streets, flags were raised, songs filled the evening air. For many, it felt like the beginning of a new chapter. Many Arab leaders, however, rejected the proposal.
They argued that the plan was unfair to the Arab majority that had long lived in the region. From their perspective, dividing the land against their wishes violated the principle of self-determination. Many families feared losing influence over the future of the country they considered their homeland. For them, the proposal did not appear as a compromise, it appeared as an unacceptable division. Neither reaction can be understood without appreciating the different historical experiences that shaped each community. Many Jewish families viewed the proposal through the lens of centuries of persecution, displacement, and the recent catastrophe of the Holocaust. Many Arab families viewed it through the lens of generations of continuous residence, local identity, and concern over rapid demographic and political change. History often presents moments when two deeply held hopes collide.
This was one of those moments. On November 29, 1947, the United Nations General Assembly voted on the Partition Plan. The proposal received enough votes to pass. Around the world, newspapers printed dramatic headlines. Radio broadcasts announced the decision. But the vote itself did not settle the dispute. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new and even more uncertain chapter. Within hours of the announcement, violence began to increase. Roads became dangerous. Convoys required protection. Fear spread through cities and villages alike. Neighbors who had traded together for years sometimes found themselves divided by politics and growing mistrust. For ordinary civilians, life became increasingly difficult. Parents worried about sending children to school. Shopkeepers wondered whether to open their businesses. Farmers feared traveling alone to distant fields. Everyone sensed that something much larger was approaching. The British administration was preparing to leave. Its departure date had been announced. Soon,
there would be no imperial government standing between the competing national movements. A political vacuum was beginning to form, and both sides understood that the decisions made in the coming months would shape the future for generations. The vote at the United Nations had offered a vision of two states. Whether that vision could become reality, no one yet knew. As the final British soldiers prepared to depart, the countdown toward one of the most significant days in Middle Eastern history had begun. And that is where our story continues.
The spring of 1948 arrived with a strange mixture of hope and uncertainty. Wildflowers bloomed across the hills. Orange groves filled the air with their familiar fragrance. The Mediterranean shimmered beneath the warm afternoon sun. Nature followed its timeless rhythm. But for the people living in Palestine, everything was about to change. The British mandate was coming to an end. For months, British officials had been packing documents, lowering flags, and preparing to leave. Their administration, which had lasted for nearly 3 decades, was reaching its final hours. As British forces withdrew, a political vacuum emerged. The United Nations Partition Plan had been approved, but it had not been accepted by all parties. Fighting between Jewish and Arab communities had already intensified during the previous months. Roads became dangerous. Some neighborhoods were divided by barricades. Travel that had once taken an hour could suddenly become impossible. Families began leaving areas where they feared violence might spread. Some believed they would return within weeks. Many could not know that their departures would become part of a much larger and more enduring story. Then came one of the most significant days in modern Middle Eastern history. On May 14, 1948, Jewish leaders gathered in Tel Aviv.
Inside a modest hall, a declaration was read aloud. It announced the establishment of the independent state of Israel. For many Jewish people, both in the region and around the world, the moment carried profound emotional meaning. After centuries without a sovereign state, and only a few years after the devastation of the Holocaust, they saw the declaration as the realization of a long-held national aspiration. In some streets, people celebrated, families embraced, flags waved in the evening breeze, music echoed through crowded squares. For many, it felt like the beginning of a new chapter. Yet for many Palestinian Arabs, the same day was experienced very differently. Communities that had already been affected by months of conflict faced growing uncertainty. Many feared for their homes, their safety, and their future. Some villages had already been emptied by fighting. Others would soon experience the same. For these families, the months surrounding 1948 became associated with displacement, loss, and the beginning of refugee journeys that would shape generations. These different experiences remain central to how the events of 1948 are remembered today. The declaration of Israel's independence was followed almost immediately by war. Neighboring Arab states, including Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, sent military forces into the former Mandate territory. Each government had its own political goals and military calculations, but all opposed the creation of the new Israeli state under the circumstances that had unfolded.
What had begun as civil conflict between communities now became an international war. Battles erupted across multiple fronts. Cities, villages, and strategic roads became contested. For soldiers, the days were filled with uncertainty. For civilians, life became increasingly difficult. Families sought shelter. Hospitals treated the wounded. Food supplies became harder to secure in some areas. Ordinary people, regardless of their background, often found themselves caught in events far beyond their control. By the time the fighting gradually came to an end in 1949, the map looked very different from the one proposed by the United Nations in 1947. Israel controlled more territory than had been allocated under the UN Partition Plan. The West Bank came under the administration of Transjordan, later known as Jordan. The Gaza Strip came under Egyptian administration. Perhaps the most lasting humanitarian consequence was the refugee crisis. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs left or were displaced from their homes during the conflict, though the circumstances varied from place to place and remain the subject of extensive historical research and debate.
At roughly the same time, large numbers of Jewish people also migrated to the new state of Israel over the following years, including Holocaust survivors from Europe and many Jews who left or were expelled from several Arab countries amid rising regional tensions. By the end of the war, a new state had been established, new borders had emerged, and new realities had taken shape. Yet none of the deeper questions had truly been resolved. Instead, many had simply entered a new phase. For one community, 1948 marked independence and national renewal. For another, it marked displacement and profound loss. Understanding both experiences is essential to understanding why the history of this land continues to resonate so deeply. The war had ended, but the story was only just beginning, and that is where our journey continues.
When the fighting gradually subsided, the silence felt unfamiliar. For months, the sounds of gunfire, military convoys, and hurried departures had become part of everyday life. Now, people looked around and realized that the landscape had changed forever. New borders had appeared on maps. New governments had taken shape, and countless families, whether they had stayed, left, or recently arrived, were trying to begin again.
For the newly established State of Israel, the first years were filled with enormous challenges. Declaring independence had been only the beginning. Now came the difficult task of building a functioning country. Government ministries had to be organized. Courts needed judges. Schools required teachers. Roads had to connect growing towns. Hospitals had to care for a rapidly increasing population. Nothing could be accomplished overnight. One of the greatest challenges was immigration. In the years following 1948, hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants arrived. Some were Holocaust survivors from Europe, carrying memories of unimaginable loss. Others came from countries across the Middle East and North Africa. Communities that had existed for centuries in places such as Iraq, Yemen, Morocco, Egypt, and elsewhere also experienced major changes during this period, leading many Jewish families to move to Israel. The new arrivals spoke different languages. They brought different foods, customs, music, and traditions. Some spoke Hebrew. Many did not. Some spoke Arabic.
Others spoke Yiddish, French, Persian, Russian, or Ladino. The diversity was remarkable, but it also created practical difficulties. Where would everyone live? How could jobs be found? How would schools teach children from so many different backgrounds? To meet the urgent need for housing, temporary camps were established. Rows of tents and simple shelters appeared across the country. Life in these camps was far from comfortable. Summer heat could be exhausting. Winter rains turned the ground into mud. Yet many families accepted these hardships, believing they were helping build a new future. At the same time, life was also changing dramatically beyond Israel's borders. Large numbers of Palestinian refugees found themselves living in neighboring areas such as the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Many expected their displacement to be temporary. Some believed they would return home within weeks or months. Instead, the refugee situation became one of the longest-lasting humanitarian issues of the modern era. Children grew up in refugee camps. Years became decades, and memories of former homes were passed from one generation to the next.
Meanwhile, the armistice agreements of 1949 ended the large-scale fighting, but they did not create a permanent peace. They established ceasefire lines rather than final international borders. Many political questions remained unresolved. Could lasting peace be achieved? Would neighboring countries eventually recognize Israel? Could refugees find durable solutions? No one yet knew the answers. Despite these uncertainties, daily life slowly returned. Markets reopened. Schools welcomed students. Farmers planted crops once again. Construction workers built homes, roads, and factories. Children born after the war knew little of the world that had existed before 1948. To them, these new realities simply became normal life. Yet beneath the surface, memories remained powerful. For many Israelis, the early years represented survival against extraordinary odds and the creation of a long-awaited homeland. For many Palestinians, the same years represented separation from homes, communities, and places deeply connected to family history. These two collective memories developed side by side, each shaped by real experiences. Each carried forward through stories told at dinner tables, in classrooms, and within families. Understanding this difference in historical memory is essential. History is not only about dates and documents. It is also about how ordinary people remember the past. As the 1950s progressed, the Middle East entered a new era. New alliances formed. Old rivalries deepened. The region became increasingly important in global politics during the Cold War. The questions left unresolved after 1948 did not disappear.
Instead, they continued to influence each new generation. The modern state of Israel had been established, but the broader story of the region, its conflicts, negotiations, hopes, and efforts towards peace, was still unfolding. And that is where our journey continues.
The first decade after Israel's creation was not a time of complete peace. The large-scale war had ended, but the region remained tense. Across the Middle East, governments were rebuilding, communities were recovering, and millions of ordinary people were trying to create stable lives after years of uncertainty. For many Israelis, every day brought the challenge of building a country almost from scratch. New neighborhoods rose where empty fields had once stretched to the horizon. Schools expanded to welcome children arriving from dozens of different countries. Hospitals treated patients speaking many different languages. Hebrew, which had long been preserved as a religious and literary language, became the common language of public life. For many immigrants, learning Hebrew was one of their first steps towards beginning a new chapter. At the same time, the economy faced enormous pressure. Food was limited, imported goods were expensive. The government introduced rationing for many everyday items. Families sometimes stood in long lines to receive basic necessities. Clothing was carefully repaired rather than replaced. Nothing was wasted. Yet, despite these hardships,
regional governments now found themselves balancing local concerns with global politics. Every decision could attract international attention. Even relatively small disputes sometimes became matters of worldwide interest. Then, in 1956, another major crisis unfolded. Its origins lay not directly in Palestine, but in neighboring Egypt. Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal, an important international waterway connecting Europe and Asia. The decision triggered an international crisis involving Egypt, Britain, France, and Israel. For several weeks, the world watched anxiously. Military operations began. Diplomats hurried between capitals. The possibility of a much larger regional conflict seemed dangerously real. International pressure eventually led to a ceasefire and the withdrawal of invading forces. The crisis demonstrated something increasingly clear. The Middle East had become one of the world's most strategically important regions. Events there no longer affected only local populations. They influenced global diplomacy, trade, and international security. For ordinary people, however, life remained centered on familiar routines. Parents prepared children for school. Farmers harvested crops. Shopkeepers opened their businesses each morning. Wedding celebrations continued. Religious festivals brought families together.
it is also about how ordinary people remember the past. As the 1950s progressed, the Middle East entered a new era. New alliances formed. Old rivalries deepened. The region became increasingly important in global politics during the Cold War. The questions left unresolved after 1948 did not disappear. Instead, they continued to influence each new generation. The modern state of Israel had been established, but the broader story of the region, its conflicts, negotiations, hopes, and efforts towards peace, was still unfolding. And that is where our journey continues. It is also about how ordinary people remember the past. As the 1950s progressed, the Middle East entered a new era. New alliances formed. Old rivalries deepened. The region became increasingly important in global politics during the Cold War. The questions left unresolved after 1948 did not disappear. Instead, they continued to influence each new generation. The modern state of Israel had been established. But the broader story of the region, its conflicts, negotiations, hopes, and efforts towards peace, was still unfolding. And that is where our journey continues.
By the middle of the 1960s, nearly 20 years had passed since the War of 1948. A new generation of children had grown into adulthood. Many had never known the world before Israel existed. For them, the borders drawn after the fighting seemed permanent. But beneath the surface, the region remained fragile. Diplomats continued meeting. Military commanders studied maps. Newspapers regularly reported rising tensions along the borders. People hoped another war could be avoided, yet many also feared that peace remained distant. Throughout the spring of 1967, concern spread across the Middle East. Neighboring countries strengthened military positions. Troops moved closer to borders. Public speeches became more confrontational. Radio broadcasts carried messages that heightened anxiety. Ordinary families listened carefully, wondering whether another conflict was approaching. Farmers continued working their fields. Children still attended school. Markets remained open. But conversations increasingly ended with the same question: will there be another war? Then, in early June 1967, the answer arrived. The conflict that followed would become known as the Six-Day War. Despite its short duration, its consequences would reshape the region for decades. The fighting moved quickly. Military operations unfolded across several fronts. Aircraft, armored vehicles, and ground forces were deployed at a pace few had expected. Within only 6 days, the military situation had changed dramatically. When the fighting stopped, the map of the Middle East looked very different.
Israel had gained control of several territories, including the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. These territorial changes transformed both military strategy and political debate. Among the most significant developments was Israel's capture of East Jerusalem. For Jewish communities around the world, access to the Old City of Jerusalem, including the Western Wall, carried profound religious and historical meaning. Many viewed the moment as deeply emotional after nearly 2 decades without Israeli control of the area. At the same time, for many Palestinians, the new reality brought uncertainty. Families living in the West Bank and Gaza now found themselves under Israeli military occupation. Daily life changed in many ways. New administrative systems were introduced. Military checkpoints appeared. Travel became more complicated in some areas. Many people wondered how long this situation would last. Some expected it to be temporary. Few imagined that it would continue for decades. Meanwhile, the international community closely watched the developments. Many governments called for negotiations. Others emphasized the importance of secure borders. Still others focused on questions of international law and the future of the newly occupied territories. One important diplomatic effort followed later that year. The United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 242. Rather than resolving every disagreement, it established principles intended to guide future negotiations.
Among them were the ideas of Israeli withdrawal from territories captured during the conflict and the right of every state in the region to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries. The wording of the resolution would become one of the most discussed diplomatic texts in modern Middle Eastern history. Different governments interpreted parts of it differently, yet it remained an important foundation for many future peace efforts. Back in everyday life, ordinary people continued adapting. Some families crossed newly opened routes to visit places they had not seen in years. Others found movement more restricted than before. Merchants adjusted their businesses. Teachers continued educating children. Doctors cared for patients regardless of politics. Life continued, as it always does.
But the questions had become even more complicated. What should happen to the territories captured during the war? Could negotiations eventually determine their future? Would peace agreements emerge? Or would the conflict simply continue under new circumstances? No one could answer with certainty. History sometimes changes gradually over generations. At other moments, everything shifts within a single week. The Six-Day War was one of those moments. In only 6 days, military victories had altered borders. Religious sites came under new administration. Millions of lives entered a different political reality. And the issues created during those 6 days would remain central to regional diplomacy for decades to come. The war had ended, but the search for a lasting peace had become even more challenging. And that is where our journey continues.
The smoke from the Six-Day War had long since cleared. The tanks were no longer advancing. The aircraft had returned to their bases. Yet, the questions left behind were far more difficult to silence than the sound of battle itself. Across Israel, across the West Bank and Gaza, across Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and the wider Middle East, people were asking the same quiet question: what happens now? For many Israeli families, the victory of 1967 had brought a greater sense of security. The country's borders had expanded. Jerusalem was now under Israeli control. Many believed the military success had prevented a larger threat. Parents hoped their children might grow up without facing another war. But security remained uncertain. The neighboring countries had not accepted the new reality. Diplomatic negotiations struggled to make progress. Military forces remained on alert. The ceasefire lines were quiet, yet everyone understood they could change again. Meanwhile, for Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza, life continued under Israeli military administration. Children still walked to school each morning. Farmers still harvested olives and citrus fruits. Markets still opened before sunrise. Weddings still filled villages with music. Families still gathered during religious holidays. Yet everyday routines now unfolded within a very different political environment. Permits, military regulations, and security measures became part of daily life for many communities. Some people adapted. Others became increasingly frustrated. Many simply wished for stability. As the years passed,
the conflict became not only a dispute over land, it also became a struggle over identity, security, memory, and the future. Then,
in October 1973, the region was once again drawn into war. On the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise military offensive against Israel. The timing caught many by surprise. During the first days of the conflict, the fighting was intense. Israeli forces faced significant challenges. Egyptian troops crossed the Suez Canal. Syrian forces advanced in the Golan Heights. For a brief moment, it appeared that the balance established after 1967 might be changing. But as the days passed, Israel regrouped. Heavy fighting continued on multiple fronts. Both sides suffered substantial military losses. Thousands of soldiers from every side would never return home. For civilians, the war brought renewed fear. Families waited anxiously for news. Hospitals filled with wounded soldiers. Parents listened to radios late into the night. Children wondered why another war had begun so soon after the last one. When the fighting finally stopped, neither side could claim an easy victory. Instead, the war left behind an important realization. Military success alone could not resolve the conflict, even after repeated wars.
But the questions had become even more complicated. What should happen to the territories captured during the war? Could negotiations eventually determine their future? Would peace agreements emerge? Or would the conflict simply continue under new circumstances? No one could answer with certainty. History sometimes changes gradually over generations. At other moments, everything shifts within a single week. The Six-Day War was one of those moments. In only 6 days, military victories had altered borders. Religious sites came under new administration. Millions of lives entered a different political reality. And the issues created during those 6 days would remain central to regional diplomacy for decades to come. The war had ended, but the search for a lasting peace had become even more challenging. And that is where our journey continues.
The underlying political questions remained. Perhaps some leaders began to think the future required diplomacy rather than another battlefield. That idea slowly gained momentum. One of the most remarkable moments came later in the decade. In 1977, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat made an unexpected decision. He traveled to Jerusalem. It was the first official visit by the leader of an Arab country to Israel. Around the world, people watched in amazement. Only a few years earlier, the two countries had been fighting one another. Now, their leaders were speaking face to face. The visit did not solve every disagreement, but it demonstrated that dialogue was possible. Months of careful negotiations followed. With the support of international mediators, Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat eventually reached a historic agreement. The result was the Camp David Accords in 1978. Soon afterward, Egypt became the first Arab country to officially recognize Israel. In return, Israel agreed to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula. The agreement showed something many people had once thought impossible. Former enemies could choose negotiation over continued war. Not everyone welcomed the agreement. Some believed it did not go far enough. Others opposed it for different reasons. Yet it proved that diplomacy could achieve results that decades of fighting had failed to produce. Still, one major issue remained unresolved: the future of the Palestinians. Questions surrounding the West Bank, Gaza, refugees, and self-determination continued without a final settlement. The road toward lasting peace was still incomplete. As the 1970s came to an end, the Middle East had witnessed both war and one of its most important peace agreements. History was beginning to show that conflict and diplomacy often exist side by side. The next decade would bring new uprisings, new negotiations, and new generations determined to shape the future in their own way. And that is where our journey continues.
The 1980s arrived quietly. The sun still rose over Jerusalem's ancient stone walls. Fishermen still cast their nets into the Mediterranean before dawn. Farmers still climbed ladders to harvest olives from trees that had stood for generations. To a visitor, life might have seemed almost unchanged. But beneath the ordinary rhythm of daily life, a new generation had grown up. Many young Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza had spent their entire lives under Israeli administration after the 1967 war. They had no personal memory of the world before it. Their parents often spoke about villages, homes, and lives that existed before 1948. Their children knew those places only through stories. At the same time, young Israelis had also grown up in a country where military service was a normal part of adulthood. Many had known only a nation surrounded by security concerns and recurring regional conflicts. Both generations inherited memories they had not personally lived. Yet those memories shaped how they understood the present. As the decade continued, economic difficulties, political frustration, and uncertainty accumulated. Daily life became increasingly challenging for many communities. Crossing checkpoints could take time. Finding stable employment was difficult for some families. Political negotiations seemed distant from everyday concerns. People often felt that decisions affecting their lives were being made elsewhere. Then, in December 1987,
a traffic accident near Gaza became the immediate spark for widespread protests. The accident itself was tragic, but the anger that followed reflected years of accumulated frustration rather than a single event. Demonstrations spread rapidly across the West Bank and Gaza. Young people organized marches, workers participated in strikes, businesses sometimes closed in protest. Teachers, students, shopkeepers, and community leaders all became involved in different ways. This period became known as the First Intifada, a word often translated as uprising or shaking off. For many Palestinians, it was a movement expressing demands for greater political rights and self-determination. For many Israelis, the unrest created serious security concerns and fears that violence might spread further. The months that followed were difficult. Israeli security forces responded to demonstrations. Some protests remained peaceful, others involved confrontations. There were injuries and deaths among both Palestinians and Israelis during the years that followed. Ordinary civilians often found themselves living through uncertainty they had never chosen. Families on every side worried about children walking to school.
Parents waited anxiously for loved ones to return home. Teachers tried to continue educating students despite frequent disruptions. Doctors treated patients regardless of politics. Life continued, but it was no longer ordinary. Meanwhile, television was changing how the world experienced distant events. For the first time, people across Europe, North America, Asia, and elsewhere regularly watched scenes from the region in their living rooms. International attention increased. Journalists reported not only on diplomacy and military operations, but also on the lives of ordinary people.
The conflict was increasingly understood as both a political dispute and a humanitarian issue affecting millions of civilians. Governments around the world renewed calls for negotiations. Many leaders concluded that managing the conflict indefinitely would not create lasting stability. The question was becoming more urgent. If repeated wars had failed, and prolonged unrest had failed, what path remained? Quietly, away from television cameras, new conversations began. Diplomats explored possibilities. Scholars exchanged ideas. Community leaders searched for common ground. The discussions were cautious, sometimes secret. Progress was slow. Trust was fragile. Yet something important had changed. Increasing numbers of people on different sides began recognizing that eventually the conflict would have to be addressed through dialogue rather than force alone. As the First Intifada continued into the early 1990s, the region stood at another crossroads. The years of protest had transformed international opinion. The need for serious negotiations was becoming more widely acknowledged. Soon, representatives who had spent decades viewing one another as enemies would quietly begin meeting face to face. Those meetings would lead to one of the most hopeful and most debated chapters in the history of the conflict. A chapter built not on military victories, but on the possibility of compromise. And that is where our journey continues.
By the early 1990s, the Middle East had spent decades living with conflict. Wars had changed borders, uprisings had changed societies. Entire generations had grown up knowing more about checkpoints, ceasefires, and negotiations than about lasting peace. Yet, history sometimes changes not through dramatic battles, but through quiet conversations. Away from television cameras, far from public speeches, a small group of negotiators began meeting in secret. The location was unexpected. Not Jerusalem, not Cairo, not Washington, but Oslo, the capital of Norway. There, in discreet rooms far from the attention of the world's media, Israeli and Palestinian representatives met face to face. For many of them, it was the first time they had spoken directly with people they had long considered political opponents. The meetings were cautious. At first, even simple conversations required patience. There was deep mistrust. Each side carried decades of painful memories. Each worried that the other might not negotiate in good faith. Progress was slow. Sometimes discussions lasted late into the night. Maps covered tables, documents were rewritten again and again. Every sentence mattered. Every word was carefully examined.
Yet something remarkable began to happen. People who had spent years speaking about one another were now speaking with one another. It did not erase disagreement, but it changed the conversation. After months of negotiation, an agreement slowly took shape. In 1993, the world watched one of the most memorable moments in modern diplomatic history. On the lawn of the White House, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, the chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, shook hands. Standing beside them
was US President Bill Clinton. For many people watching around the world, the handshake symbolized something extraordinary. Not the end of conflict, but the possibility that peace might finally be within reach. The agreement became known as the Oslo Accords. It did not resolve every issue. Instead, it created a framework for gradual negotiations. The two sides formally recognized one another.
The Palestinian Authority was established to administer parts of the West Bank and Gaza. Both sides agreed to continue negotiating difficult questions in the future. Those questions included the final borders, the future of Jerusalem, Israeli settlements, security arrangements, and the question of Palestinian refugees. These issues were intentionally left for later discussions because negotiators believed they required more time. For a brief period, optimism spread. Many Israelis hoped their children might grow up without another major war. Many Palestinians hoped that statehood and greater self-government were finally becoming realistic possibilities. Across the region, people imagined a future that seemed almost impossible only a few years earlier. Schools discussed peace. Newspapers printed hopeful headlines. Families spoke about tomorrow with cautious optimism. But peace is often more fragile than people wish. Not everyone supported the agreements. On both sides, there were groups that opposed compromise. Some believed the concessions went too far. Others believed they did not go far enough. Political debates became increasingly intense. Acts of violence by extremists also continued, damaging trust and making negotiations more difficult. Then, in 1995, tragedy struck. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli extremist who opposed the peace process. The news shocked the world. Many wondered whether the momentum toward peace had suffered a devastating setback. Negotiations continued, but they became more complicated. Trust weakened, political leadership changed, public opinion shifted. Hope remained, yet uncertainty returned. Looking back today, many historians describe the Oslo years as a rare moment when both sides came closer to a negotiated settlement than ever before. Others argue that the agreements left too many fundamental questions unanswered. Both perspectives continue to shape discussions today. What is certain is that Oslo demonstrated something important. Even after decades of war, dialogue remained possible. Even after generations of conflict, people could still sit together at the same table. Whether that dialogue would ultimately succeed was a question history had not yet answered. As the 20th century drew toward its end, the region stood between hope and disappointment. The next chapter would test whether the fragile foundation built in Oslo could survive the pressures of a changing world. And that is where our journey continues. The 20th century was coming to a close. Across the Middle East, people welcomed a new millennium with familiar hopes. Parents wished for peaceful lives for their children. Students dreamed about education and careers. Shopkeepers opened their businesses each morning. Farmers continued tending olive groves that had belonged to their families for generations. Life, despite decades of conflict, always found a way to continue. Yet beneath the quiet rhythm of everyday life, the peace process was struggling. The optimism that had followed the Oslo Accords had begun to fade. Many of the most difficult questions remained unresolved. Where would the final borders be drawn? What would become of Jerusalem? How could security be guaranteed? What future awaited Palestinian refugees? Years passed. Negotiations continued, but agreement remained out of reach. Then, in the summer of 2000, leaders gathered once again. this time at Camp David in the United States. Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, and US President Bill Clinton spent days discussing possible compromises. Maps were examined. Ideas were proposed. Long hours were devoted to finding common ground. But despite intense negotiations, no final agreement was reached. Each side believed that essential concerns remained unresolved. The disappointment was profound. Only a few months later, another turning point arrived.
In late 2000, a visit by Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon to the Temple Mount, known to Muslims as the Haram al-Sharif, became one of the immediate triggers for widespread protests. The visit occurred amid already high political tensions, and demonstrations quickly spread. The unrest soon developed into what became known as the Second Intifada. Unlike the first uprising, this period saw far greater levels of violence. There were shootings, bombings, military operations. Israeli civilians and Palestinian civilians both experienced devastating losses. Families on every side mourned loved ones. Children grew up hearing ambulance sirens instead of peaceful evening conversations. Parents worried each morning when family members left home. Some wondered whether they would all return safely by nightfall. As violence increased, trust became even harder to rebuild. Israeli strengthened security measures. Checkpoints expanded. Military operations intensified in response to attacks. In the early 2000s, Israel also began constructing a large security barrier along and near parts of the West Bank. Israeli officials argued that the barrier was intended to reduce attacks against civilians. Many Palestinians argued that it severely affected daily life, movement, and access to land and services. The barrier itself became another symbol of the broader conflict. To different communities, it represented very different realities. Meanwhile, diplomatic efforts did not completely disappear. International organizations, regional governments, and world leaders continued searching for ways to revive negotiations. Plans were proposed, meetings were held, statements were issued.
Yet lasting progress remained difficult. By the middle of the decade, the region experienced another major change. In 2005, Israel withdrew its military forces and dismantled its settlements in the Gaza Strip. Many observers hoped this decision might reduce tensions and open a new chapter. Instead, the years that followed brought new political divisions. Different Palestinian political groups competed for leadership. Eventually, separate administrations emerged in the West Bank and Gaza. This internal division added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. Looking back, the early years of the 21st century remind us that history rarely moves in a straight line. Moments of hope can be followed by disappointment. Periods of negotiation can be interrupted by violence. And even after years of conflict, people continue searching for ways to build more peaceful futures. For ordinary families, the hopes remained surprisingly simple: safety, opportunity, education, a secure home, the chance to raise children without fear. Those hopes sounded remarkably similar, whether spoken in Hebrew or Arabic, whether expressed in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Ramallah, or Gaza. The political disagreements remained profound, but the everyday dreams of ordinary people often shared much in common. As our story moves closer to the present day, the challenges become even more complex. New conflicts, new diplomatic efforts, and new generations would inherit one of the world's longest-running disputes. And that is where our journey continues.
As the years moved forward, the region entered a new chapter. The headlines often focused on conflict, rocket fire, military operations, political disagreements.
emergency meetings, international diplomacy. But beyond the headlines, millions of ordinary people continued living ordinary lives. Each morning, parents prepared breakfast. Children packed school bags. Doctors began hospital rounds. Teachers welcomed students into classrooms. Bakers placed fresh bread into hot ovens before sunrise. Life, even in times of uncertainty, continued one day at a time. For Israelis, technology, science, medicine, and business expanded rapidly during the early 21st century. Cities grew larger. Universities attracted students from around the world. New companies developed innovations in medicine, agriculture, and computer technology. Modern highways connected expanding communities. At the same time, military service remained part of life for many young Israelis. Security continued to shape everyday decisions. Public shelters became familiar features in some towns. Emergency warning systems were developed. Many families hoped they would never need to use them. Meanwhile, across the West Bank and Gaza, Palestinian society also continued adapting to difficult circumstances. Universities educated new generations of students. Artists created music and paintings. Entrepreneurs opened businesses despite economic challenges. Families celebrated weddings. Children played football in narrow streets. Life was often complicated, but it continued. Movement restrictions, economic pressures, and political uncertainty affected many communities. Different areas experienced different realities. Some cities expanded economically, others struggled with unemployment and limited opportunities. The experiences of daily life were not the same everywhere. Meanwhile, the Gaza Strip faced repeated periods of armed conflict. Several rounds of fighting occurred over the years between Israel and armed groups based in Gaza, including Hamas. Each escalation brought suffering to civilians. Israeli communities faced rocket attacks and periods of fear. Palestinian civilians in Gaza experienced airstrikes, destruction, displacement, and severe humanitarian challenges. International organizations repeatedly called for protecting civilians and reducing violence. After each ceasefire, people returned to repairing homes, reopening shops, cleaning schools, trying once again to rebuild normal routines. Alongside these conflicts, diplomatic efforts continued. Some neighboring Arab countries gradually chose to improve relations with Israel. Supporters hoped that greater regional cooperation might reduce tensions and encourage economic development. Others argued that broader questions, especially those concerning Palestinians, still required comprehensive solutions. Different opinions remained. Different visions for the future continued to compete. Yet throughout these years, one truth remained remarkably constant. Most ordinary people wanted lives that looked surprisingly similar. A stable job, a safe neighborhood, good schools, reliable healthcare.
A peaceful future for their children. These hopes crossed languages, religions, and borders. Historians often remind us that political history usually focuses on presidents, prime ministers, generals, and diplomats. But everyday history belongs to everyone else. It belongs to the farmer harvesting olives before sunrise, the nurse working through the night, the university student preparing for exams, the shopkeeper opening a small family business, the child drawing pictures of tomorrow. These lives rarely appear in history books, yet together
They form the true heartbeat of every society. As we approach the final chapter of our journey, it becomes clear that the story of Israel's creation cannot be understood through a single event. It was shaped by centuries of history, religious traditions, national movements, global wars, diplomatic decisions, human migration, hope, fear, and the everyday choices made by millions of ordinary people. The past cannot be changed, but understanding it carefully can help us better understand the present. Our journey is almost complete. One final chapter remains, a chapter that steps back from individual events and reflects on what this 100-year story teaches us about history itself. And that is where our journey concludes.
Our journey has carried us across more than 100 years. We have walked through quiet Ottoman villages, watched new immigrants arrive with hope in their hearts, seen empires disappear, observed diplomats drawing lines on maps, witnessed wars that reshaped borders, and followed generations of ordinary families trying to build peaceful lives. Now, as the evening grows quieter, let us pause for a moment and simply look back. History is often described through great leaders, kings, prime ministers, generals, presidents. But when we step away from the headlines, another story becomes visible. The story of ordinary people. Imagine a young farmer living near Jerusalem in 1905. His greatest concern is whether the winter rains will arrive on time. He knows little about international diplomacy. He has never met a politician. He simply hopes for a good harvest. Now imagine a Jewish family living in Eastern Europe during those same years. Their grandparents still speak of Jerusalem with deep affection. They hope their children will grow up in safety and dignity. They cannot imagine the terrible events that the 20th century will soon bring. Neither family knows the other. Neither realizes that history will eventually connect their futures. That is one of history's quietest lessons. The people living through great events rarely understand that they are living through history at all. They simply wake up each morning, go to work, care for children, celebrate weddings, mourn loved ones,
and hope tomorrow will be a little better than today. Only years later do historians place names upon the chapters. The Balfour Declaration, the British Mandate, the Holocaust, the Partition Plan, the War of 1948, the Six-Day War, the Oslo Accords. Each became a title in history books. Yet behind every title were millions of individual lives, some filled with hope, others marked by loss, many containing both. Another lesson quietly emerges from this long story. History is rarely simple. The same event can be remembered in profoundly different ways. A single date may represent celebration for one community and sorrow for another. A border drawn on a map may symbolize security for one family and separation for another. Recognizing these different historical memories does not require abandoning one perspective in favor of another. Instead, it reminds us that understanding history often begins with listening carefully. Listening does not always produce agreement, but it does create understanding. Throughout our journey,
we have also seen how decisions made far away shaped everyday lives. Diplomats in London, delegates at the United Nations, leaders meeting in Washington,
negotiators gathering quietly in Oslo. Their signatures changed the future of people they would never meet. The farmer harvesting olives, the child walking to school, the shopkeeper opening a market stall. History often feels distant, yet it quietly enters ordinary lives in unexpected ways. Perhaps the greatest lesson of all is that the future is never fully written. When people stood in 1900, they could not foresee 1948. Those living in 1948 could not imagine the Oslo negotiations. Those celebrating peace agreements could not predict future setbacks. History always contains uncertainty. That uncertainty can be frightening, but it also leaves room for possibility. Every new generation inherits the past, yet each generation also writes its own chapter. The choices made today will one day become the history studied by future students. Perhaps they will remember moments of conflict. Perhaps they will remember moments of cooperation. Most likely, they will remember both. As our story draws towards its close, the ancient hills remain. The olive trees continue growing. Pilgrims still walk through Jerusalem's stone streets. Children still laugh in schoolyards. Markets still open before sunrise. Life continues, as it has for thousands of years. Empires come and go. Governments rise and fall. Borders change. But ordinary people continue searching for the same simple things: a safe home, a meaningful life, a hopeful future for their children. Those hopes have changed very little across the centuries, and perhaps that quiet truth has always been the most enduring part of history. And now, only one final chapter remains, a peaceful reflection on everything we have learned together, and that is where our journey gently comes to an end.
Our journey is nearly over. For the past few hours, we have traveled across more than a century of history, not by rushing from battle to battle, nor by following only the lives of famous leaders, but by walking quietly beside ordinary people, people who never imagined they would become part of history. We met farmers who measured time by the harvest, merchants who greeted the sunrise by opening wooden shutters, children who played in dusty streets without knowing that the maps around them would one day change, families who hoped only for safety, meaningful work, and a peaceful future. Those hopes were simple, and in many ways, they remain the same today. As we look back, one lesson stands above all others. History is rarely made in a single moment.
The modern state of Israel did not appear overnight. Its creation was shaped by centuries of religious tradition, changing political ideas, migration, international diplomacy, world wars, and decisions made by people living both within and far beyond the region. Likewise, the experiences of Palestinian communities were shaped by generations of continuous life in the land, the upheavals of the 20th century, displacement for many families, and the continuing search for security, identity, and self-determination. Understanding this history does not require choosing one story and ignoring another. The past is often more complicated than that. Different communities remember the same events in different ways because they lived them differently. History asks us to recognize those different experiences, even when agreement remains difficult. If we have learned anything during this long journey, it is that ordinary people usually carry the greatest burdens of extraordinary times. When governments negotiate, families wait. When borders change, children still need schools. When wars begin, parents still hope their loved ones return safely. And when peace finally arrives, It is ordinary people who quietly rebuild homes, reopen shops, replant orchards, and begin again. That quiet resilience is one of history's most remarkable qualities. Across this small stretch of land, empires have risen and fallen. The Ottoman Empire ruled for centuries before fading into history. The British Mandate governed for only a few decades. New states emerged, old political systems disappeared. Yet the hills remained. The olive trees continued to grow.
The Mediterranean continued meeting the shore each morning, and the ancient streets of Jerusalem welcomed new generations of visitors just as they had for thousands of years. History often feels permanent while we are living through it. Yet every generation believes its present will last forever. Few people in 1900 imagined the world of 1950. Few people in 1950 imagined the world of today. The future has always surprised humanity. Perhaps it always will. As we finish tonight's story, there is one final thought worth carrying with us. The past can explain many things. It can help us understand how nations were formed, why communities remember events differently, how decisions made decades ago continue to shape lives today. But history cannot tell us exactly what tomorrow will bring. That chapter has not yet been written. It belongs to future generations. Just as every generation before us inherited a complicated world, each generation also has the opportunity to shape the one that follows. And perhaps that is the quiet beauty of studying history. Not simply to remember what happened, but to better understand the people who lived through it. Their fears, their hopes, their mistakes, their courage, and their determination to keep moving forward. Now, the evening has grown still. The streets we imagined have become quiet once again. The market stalls are closed. The lanterns burn softly in the windows.
A cool breeze moves gently through the olive branches. The distant sound of footsteps slowly fades into the night. Our long journey through a century of history has reached its peaceful conclusion. Thank you for joining me on this calm walk through one of the most fascinating and complex stories of the modern world. Until our next journey, may your evening be peaceful. May your thoughts grow lighter. And may you rest well. Good night.